I remember sitting on the edge of my bed as a kid in a drafty house in rural Pennsylvania, staring at the gap between the floorboards and the bottom of the closet door. It's a universal image, isn't it? The shadow that seems a little too thick to be just a shadow. The creak that sounds too rhythmic to be the house settling. We're told this is just a phase, a biological byproduct of a developing brain trying to map out a world it doesn't yet understand. We call him the Boogeyman. He is the default setting for human terror. But as I've spent the last few years pulling apart the municipal records of the Tudor era and the early colonial settlements of the New World, I've started to realize that the monster under the bed didn't evolve in our basements. He was manufactured in a courtroom. He wasn't a product of the imagination, he was a product of the law. We like to think of folklore as something that bubbles up from the soil, a collection of organic stories told by peasants to explain the unexplainable. But the history of the bogey or the bugbear tells a much colder story. When I was digging through the archives of the British Library last spring, I found a series of 16th century pamphlets that weren't about myths or legends. They were about crowd control. They were about the hue and cry, the legal obligation of citizens to pursue criminals. And nestled within these dry bureaucratic instructions on how to maintain order in the dark, there was a recurring theme. The night was not just dangerous because of thieves, it was dangerous because of something other, something that the state seemed very keen on making sure you believed in. I began to wonder why the 1500s were the specific moment when this shapeless, nameless terror began to solidify into a cultural staple. Before that, monsters were specific. You had the spirits of the woods or the water, but the boogeyman was different. He was a generalist, he didn't have a face and he didn't have a fixed location. He was simply wherever you weren't supposed to be. If you look at the geography of the era, the map of the world was changing. In England, the Enclosure Acts were stripping away the common lands, turning forests and meadows where people had walked for generations into private, forbidden estates. The state was drawing lines across the earth, and they needed a way to make sure the people respected those lines, even when the sun went down and the guards went home. I've looked at the old maps of these territories, and you can see the tension. There were black zones, marshes, deep woods, and royal hunting grounds that were becoming increasingly valuable to the nobility and increasingly necessary for the survival of the poor. The authorities faced a logistical nightmare. How do you police a population that is hungry and knows the terrain better than you do? You can't put a soldier behind every oak tree. You can't light up the countryside. So, you weaponize the darkness itself. You take the natural ancestral fear of the unknown and you give it a name. You tell the children, and by extension their parents, that if they wander past the stone marker at the edge of the village after the curfew bell, they won't just be arrested, they will be taken. It was a brilliant piece of psychological engineering. By turning the state's property into the monster's territory, the authorities shifted the burden of enforcement from the constable to the individual's own nervous system. You didn't need a fence when the air itself felt heavy with the threat of a bogey. I found a record from a small parish in East Anglia from 1582, where a magistrate explicitly instructed the local town crier to spread tales of the dark man near a specific stretch of river where illegal fishing was rampant. They didn't want to catch people. They wanted people to be too terrified to even try. It makes you ask yourself, how much of our childhood fear was actually a leftover tool of 16th century property law? The transition from a tool of the state to a nursery rhyme happened so gradually that we never noticed the hand of the architect. We think we're protecting our children when we tell them to stay in bed, but we're actually echoing a 400-year-old curfew. The boogeyman was the first no trespassing sign written in the language of nightmares, because that was the only language everyone understood. But why did this specific monster stick? Why did he survive the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the Age of Science? Why do we still feel that prickle on the back of our necks when we look into a dark hallway? The answer lies in the way the authorities of the 1500s understood the human mind better than we give them credit for. They knew that a man will fight a soldier, but he will hide from a shadow. If you look at the etymology of the word, it takes you down a path of intentional confusion. Bogger, bugger, bogle, they all stem from Middle English words for a scarecrow or a spectre. But in the mid-1500s, the usage shifted. It became a verb. To bug someone was to frighten them, specifically with a false or manufactured image. It was a term used by the educated elite to describe the way they manipulated the superstitious masses. They were laughing about it in their private correspondence, even as they were codifying it into the social fabric. I found a letter from a courtier in the 1570s who described the use of night terrors as a cheap and effective wall against the wandering poor. It was a conscious strategy. The 16th century was a pressure cooker of social change. The Reformation had stripped away many of the old religious protections, the saints, the holy water, the charms that people used to feel safe. The world had become a colder, more clinical place, but the fear of the dark remained. The state stepped into that vacuum. Instead of the church providing a shield against the demonic, the state provided the demon as a way to regulate behavior. It was a trade-off. They gave us the boogeyman to keep us off their land, and in return they gave us the safety of our own hearths, as long as we stayed within the boundaries they drew. I've spent nights looking at the hue and cry ledgers, tracking the reported sightings of strange figures in the woods. What's striking is how often these sightings coincided with periods of civil unrest or food shortages. When the people were most likely to rebel, the monsters became most active. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a distraction. If the population is looking for a monster in the trees, they aren't looking for the tax collector at the door. The boogeyman was a pressure valve, a way to channel the anxiety of a changing world into a form that the state could control. He was the ultimate invisible policeman, one who never slept, never took a bribe, and never needed a paycheck. We see the remnants of this in the way we still talk about the wrong side of the tracks or the dark parts of town. We've internalized the idea that certain areas are inherently dangerous, not because of the people there, but because of an atmospheric threat. This is the legacy of the 16th century state. They taught us to fear the geography of the night so they wouldn't have to watch us. They turned the map of our world into a minefield of psychological triggers. I remember reading a diary of a merchant from London in the late 1500s who wrote that he felt safer in a city with tales of bogies than in one with 1,000 guards. He understood the economy of fear. He knew that the most effective cage is the one you build for yourself. But there was a specific event in 1594 that changed everything. A moment where the state's monster actually collided with a real-world tragedy. It happened in a small village on the outskirts of the New Forest, a place where the royal hunting laws were enforced with brutal efficiency. The locals had been warned for months about a great dark beast that haunted the perimeter of the king's woods. The parents kept their children locked away, and the men refused to go out after dusk. The village was paralyzed, exactly as the local sheriff intended. But then, something went wrong. A fire broke out in a cottage near the edge of the forest. The villagers, terrified of the beast they had been told was waiting for them in the shadows, refused to leave their homes to help. They stayed behind their bolted doors while a family screamed for help just a few hundred yards away. When the sun came up, the cost of the state's psychological wall became clear. The sheriff hadn't just kept people out of the woods, he had destroyed the community's ability to protect itself. The fear he had cultivated for the sake of the king's deer had turned into a poison that paralyzed the very people he was supposed to govern. This is the danger of the boogeyman. Once you release a monster into the collective psyche, you lose control over who it hunts. The state found that they could start the fire of fear, but they couldn't always direct the smoke. That tragedy in 1594 was the first time the authorities realized that their most effective tool was also their most unpredictable one. After that winter of 1594, you'd think the authorities in London and the rural shires would have backed away from the brink. You'd think they'd realize that manufacturing a phantom was a recipe for social paralysis, but the state is a cold machine, and it saw something in those ashes that it liked. It saw that fear worked better than any wall. If you build a stone wall, people will eventually find a way to climb over it. But if you build a wall of shadows in the mind, they won't even try to find the ladder. This was the moment the bogey transitioned from a generic spirit of the hills into a specific targeted instrument of the law. I've spent the last few months tracking the evolution of the word itself. If you look at the Middle English and early Tudor records, the terms buggy or bogle were used to describe anything that caused a fright, usually a shapeless, harmless ghost that rattled some chains and went on its way. But as we move into the late 1500s, the language hardens. The bogeyman becomes a masculine predatory figure. He's no longer just a spirit that haunts a bridge. He's the thing that waits specifically for those who break the rules. He becomes the enforcer for the masterless men laws. To understand why the state needed a monster, you have to understand the sheer panic of the Elizabethan government regarding movement. The 16th century was a time of massive upheaval. The monasteries had been dissolved, leaving thousands of people without the traditional safety nets of the church. You had soldiers returning from wars in Europe with no jobs and no homes. The roads were suddenly full of people who didn't belong anywhere. To the state, a person who moves is a person who can't be taxed, a person who can't be watched, and a person who can't be controlled. They passed the Vagrancy Acts, which were some of the most brutal pieces of legislation in English history. If you were caught wandering without a fixed address, you could be whipped, branded with a V on your chest, or even executed. But the problem was enforcement. England didn't have a professional police force. They had the Watch, usually a group of elderly underpaid men with lanterns and sticks, who were more likely to fall asleep than catch a nimble thief. They couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't patrol the deep lanes of Devon or the dense thickets of the Midlands. So the state did what any cash-strapped regime does. They outsourced the work to the imagination. They began to circulate true accounts of creatures that specifically targeted travelers at night. They took the old pagan fears of the woods and gave them a new legalistic bite. I found a series of broadsides from the 1620s that are chilling in their transparency. They weren't just stories. They were warnings disguised as folklore. They described a figure known as the Black Man or the Bogey, who patrolled the outskirts of villages. The detail that caught my eye was that this monster didn't just eat people. He carried a sack or a basket. Why a sack? Because that was the tool of the beadle, the low-level parish official responsible for hauling vagrants to the House of Correction. The monster was literally modeled after the tax collector and the jailer. The state was telling its citizens, if the law doesn't catch you, the thing that looks like the law but has teeth will. This is where the monster under the bed and the thing in the closet really started to take root in the domestic space. We think of these as universal, timeless childhood fears, but their geography is very specific to the 16th and 17th centuries. In a Tudor home, the under-the-bed area wasn't just a dusty void. It was where you kept your most valuable possessions, chests of linens, silver, or tools. The closet or the cupboard was the only place in the house that could be locked. By telling children that the bogeyman lived in these specific spots, parents were unwittingly acting as security guards for the household's assets. If you can't afford a lock, you use a legend. You tell the kid that if they open that chest or crawl into that dark corner, the bogeyman will snatch them. It was a way to protect property in an age of extreme scarcity. I remember reading a diary entry from a merchant in Bristol, dated 1612. He wrote about his frustration with his apprentices, who were prone to sneaking out at night to drink and gamble. He didn't threaten them with a pay cut or a beating. He knew they'd just get better at hiding. Instead, he started seeding the house with stories of a lumbering shadow that had been seen near the wharf, a creature that supposedly sucked the breath out of young men found in the streets after the 10 o'clock bell. He wrote with a disturbing level of satisfaction that within a week his boys were bolted in their rooms by 9. He called it the most economical watchman I have ever employed. The state's monster eventually made its way across the Atlantic, packed into the crates of the Puritans and the early settlers of the Virginia Company. But in the American colonies, the boogeyman took on an even darker, more existential tone. In the woods of Massachusetts, the black man became the primary tool of social cohesion. The leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were obsessed with the idea that the wilderness was the devil's territories. They needed to keep their small, fragile settlements from fracturing. If a young man or woman decided they'd rather live among the indigenous tribes or strike out on their own, the whole colony could collapse. So, they refined the boogeyman. They turned him into a recruiter. They told stories of a dark figure who walked the woods with a book, asking people to sign their names in blood. It was a brilliant, horrific piece of psychological engineering. It turned the act of leaving the village, the act of seeking freedom or a different life, into a literal pact with a monster. When you look at the transcripts of the Salem Witch Trials, you see the state's boogeyman in every testimony. The spectral evidence wasn't just mass hysteria, it was the manifestation of a century of government-sponsored terror. The monster had moved from the lanes of England to the forests of Salem, but its job remained the same: keep them in the house, keep them in the church, and keep them under the thumb of the authorities. What fascinates me and frankly disturbs me is how we've sanitized this. We've turned a government-mandated curfew ghost into a plush toy or a cartoon character. We've forgotten that for 200 years the boogeyman was a very real part of the legal landscape. He was the shadow of the gallows. He was the reason you didn't question the curfew, the reason you didn't wander off the path, and the reason you stayed in your assigned place in the social hierarchy. He was the ultimate invisible policeman. I was looking at an old map of London from the mid-1600s, and someone had doodled a small horned figure in the wastelands outside the city walls. Next to it, in cramped, hurried script, were the words, "Hic sunt bogles." Here are the boglemen. It wasn't a joke. It was a boundary marker. It was the state saying, everything inside this line is ours, and everything outside is his. They had successfully divided the world into the taxable and the terrified, and the most successful part of the whole operation? They didn't even have to pay the monster a salary. They just had to keep the lights out and let the imagination do the heavy lifting. But as the 18th century approached, the state realized that people were starting to get used to the dark. They needed a new kind of monster, one that didn't just haunt the woods, but one that could follow you into the light of the new modern world. When the gas lamps finally flickered to life in the mid-1800s, first in the smog-heavy streets of London, and then across the Atlantic in the burgeoning neighborhoods of Philadelphia and New York, the authorities faced a quiet crisis of control. You can't easily tell a grown man that a bogle or a bugaboo is waiting in the alley when the alley is glowing with a warm, artificial yellow light. The physical shadows were retreating, and with them, the old horned monsters were losing their grip on the public imagination. But the state is an adaptable organism. It didn't retire the boogeyman. It just gave him a haircut, a change of clothes, and a new zip code. The monster stopped being a supernatural beast lurking in the parish woods and started being the stranger. The transition was subtle, but I've seen the evidence of it in the shifting language of 19th century American parenting manuals. In the early colonial days, the warnings were about the black dog or the wood witch. By the time the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, those warnings had morphed into a fear of the unseen vagrant or the malicious traveler. The goal remained identical to the 16th century curfew. Keep the family unit isolated, keep the children inside after dark, and ensure that any movement outside the sanctioned social circle was viewed with immediate, paralyzing suspicion. It was the birth of the modern fear-based system of social management. By keeping the population afraid of an ill-defined, predatory other, the state ensures that we constantly look toward the police, the courts, and the municipal codes for a sense of safety that they themselves undermined by manufacturing the fear in the first place. I spent some time looking into the history of company towns in West Virginia and Pennsylvania during the early 1900s. These were places where the coal and steel giants owned the houses, the stores, and the very air the workers breathed. In these closed systems, the boogeyman wasn't a ghost. He was a union organizer, or rather, the shadow of one. The management would spread rumors of violent nightmen or saboteurs lurking near the mines after the whistle blew. It was the same old trick. They used the myth of a nighttime predator to keep the workers from meeting in secret, from organizing, or from simply wandering off the company property. They recycled the 16th century bogle and rebranded him as a threat to the American way of life. They didn't need to hire more guards. They just needed to make the dark feel heavy with the threat of the unknown. Even the architecture of our homes changed to accommodate this state-sponsored paranoia. I noticed a strange detail while studying the blueprints of mid-century American suburban houses. Before the late 1800s, the closet, as we know it, a deep, dark, enclosed space inside a bedroom, wasn't a standard feature. People used wardrobes or chests. But as we moved toward a more atomized, private way of living, we built these perfect little voids right into the walls where our children sleep. We created a physical space for the monster to inhabit. We gave the state's favorite ghost a permanent residence in the modern home. The monster in the closet is a specifically modern capitalist invention. It's a way of teaching a child from the moment they can speak that even their most private sanctuary can be invaded by an unseen force if they don't follow the rules of the house. I remember talking to a retired detective in Chicago a few years back who had spent 30 years patrolling the city's toughest beats. He told me something that stayed with me, something that made the whole history of the boogeyman click into place. He said that the most effective tool he ever had wasn't a sidearm or a pair of handcuffs. It was the unseen threat. He told me that if people aren't at least a little bit afraid of what's lurking around the corner, They start asking too many questions about why the corner needs to be patrolled by the state at all. We've traded the 16th century fear of a swamp monster for a 21st century fear of the unvetted person. We've internalized the curfew. We don't need a town crier to tell us to lock our doors or stay off the grass anymore. We have 24-hour news cycles and neighborhood watch apps that do the job with much more efficiency. We are now our own jailers, haunted by a ghost that the authorities stopped even having to describe. The most chilling part of this realization is how the boogeyman was used to colonize the mind. In the American South, the myth of the nighttime monster was weaponized for centuries to keep enslaved people from escaping, and later, to keep marginalized communities from asserting their right to the public square after sundown. The patrols often dressed in white or used masks to simulate the supernatural, leaning into the existing folklore of haints and spirits to enforce a very physical, very legal boundary. They took the boogeyman out of the nursery and put him on a horse. They proved that if you can make a person believe that the night is filled with monsters, you don't need to build a wall to keep them in their place. The fear does the work of 1,000 soldiers. So when you find yourself checking under the bed tonight, or when you feel that sudden irrational urge to double-check the deadbolt because the streetlights went out, ask yourself who benefits from that prickle of hair on the back of your neck. The boogeyman wasn't born in the woods or in the dark recesses of our evolutionary biology. He was born in a ledger. He was a line item in the budget of social control. We keep the monster alive because the alternative, realizing that the only thing we should truly fear is the authority that needs us terrified to justify its own existence, is far more uncomfortable than any ghost. The file on the boogeyman isn't a collection of campfire stories. It's a history of management. It's a record of how easily we can be herded into our homes by a shadow that has no weight and no name. I'm closing this archive now, but I suspect that as long as there is a law to be enforced or a boundary to be guarded, something will be waiting in the dark to make sure you stay exactly where you're told to be. If you want to find the real monster, stop looking at the shadows under the bed and start looking at the hand that's holding the flashlight. Next time you hear a creak in the hallway and your heart starts to race, remember that you aren't reacting to a monster. You're reacting to 500 years of conditioning. You're hearing the echo of a 16th century curfew bell that never stopped ringing. The boogeyman isn't coming for you. He's already done his job. He's kept you inside. He's kept you quiet. And he's kept you looking for a protector in the very people who invented him. Go look at your local curfew laws or the fine print in your homeowner's insurance. You'll find him there hiding in the legalese, still making sure you're home before the sun goes down. That's the end.